Hey, here we are with another flipped video. Today we're going to be talking about absolutism. Absolutism happened in the 1500s, kind of during the time of Renaissance, and was a time period in which kings and queens were like, yo, my power is the power. The essential questions that we'll be going over in this video are what challenges were experienced by absolute monarchs, and what were the main achievements of monarchs in Europe during the age of absolutism. Golden historians will analyze political, economic, military, and cultural methods used by absolute monarchs to gain power. While you're watching the video, make sure that you're taking notes in either Cornell or outline format after we talked about in class. It's okay if you have to pause or rewind the video in order to make sure that you're taking good notes. Get down those bolded and underlined words. Kings in Europe had started to expand their power and claim titles as absolute monarchs, or rulers whose powers was not limited by having to consult with the nobles, common people, or any representatives. So they didn't have parliament, they didn't want any nobles that they had to talk to in order to get money. They wanted their power to be the power. Most of the absolute monarchs believed that they had a divine right, or that they had received their power from God, and therefore no one could challenge them, unless you wanted to challenge God. King Charles of Spain had been ruling over Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, as well as a bunch of colonies in America for quite some time. When the title of the Holy Roman Emperor became available, he claimed that title as well, trying to expand his empire to include Italy, Austria, and part of Germany. As the king of the Holy Roman Empire, his power was directly tied to the Catholic Church because the Pope was the one who awarded the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And the Protestant Reformation really threatened his influence. Holy Roman Emperor Charles was forced into signing the Treaty of Peace of Augsburg that gave German princes the right to decide whether their state would be Catholic or Protestant. When he gave up his throne, he divided the empire between his brother and his son, who became known as Philip II. Now, Spain was in a golden age under Philip II, mainly due to the steady stream of gold and silver that had been coming in from the American colonies in Central America. With so much wealth, Spanish power grew immensely, and other people started to get a little bit concerned about the Spanish power. He started to experience some troubles uniting his land holdings because he had such a vast empire, and there were so many parts of his empire that were Catholic and Protestant, and they did not really get along. The Dutch Protestants refused to pledge allegiance to Philip because he was Catholic, and so he sent an army to torture them. In addition, the English challenged the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada had kind of been this big bunch of ships that had kind of grown over time to show the Spanish power. When the Spanish Armada was returning from the American colonies, they started to attack their ship, trying to steal the treasures that they had gotten in their colonies. This British defeat of the Spanish Armada led to a decline in their wealth and ultimately a decline in their whole total empire, because it kind of showed that their power wasn't as big as they thought it was. After the Protestant Reformation started in Germany, it quickly spread to France, and a group called the Huguenots, or French Calvinist Christians, became one of the most predominant religions in France. A lot of the nobles were Huguenots, but the king of France was Catholic, and so the Huguenots really threatened the power of the Catholic French monarchy. Now, there was a lot of tension here, and so the Queen of France ordered assassination of all of the French Huguenots in Paris in 1572. During that same weekend, there was a really big group of nobles and Huguenots in Paris with Henry of Navarre for a noble's wedding. They all were slaughtered except for Henry of Navarre, who said that he was not Protestant and claimed that he was Catholic. And the slaughter, as you can see in the picture up in the top right-hand corner, became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It was one of the largest religious conflicts during this time period. The newly crowned king, when Henry of Navarre became king, he gave Protestants more rights by issuing the Edict of Nantes that gave religious freedom to Huguenots. And this was a really important break with tradition because this was the first time in which he chose religious freedom over unity. When King Henry IV was tragically murdered, King Louis XIII became king and was advised by a prominent Catholic cardinal named Cardinal Richelieu. Their first goal was to reduce the power of the Huguenots and overall the Protestants, and they did that through really harsh means. When he died, though, his son Louis, who became known as Louis XIV, became king, leading France to prosperity through absolute power. He became known as the Sun King because he believed that everything in the world should revolve around him. And he demanded that he be in charge of the military, the politics, the economic initiatives, and he had to make every single decision. He also influenced the nobles by requiring them to visit him at his palace in Versailles outside of Paris, which pretty much moved the entire government of France outside of Paris. He had revoked the Edict of Nantes, bringing back religious control underneath the king as well, because he wanted everyone to be Catholic. King Louis XIV lived an extravagant lifestyle and really depended heavily on the taxes of the French citizens in order to uphold his lifestyle and also to expand the French Empire. In the War of Spanish Succession, King Louis XIV wanted to claim the Spanish crown and take over the Spanish Empire as a whole. Other European monarchs didn't really want France to have that much power, and so they continued to fight against the French and what became known as the 7 Years' War, and they started fighting in the colonies in America as well. Louis XIV accepted the Treaty of Utrecht and eventually that agreed that his grandson would receive the Spanish crown, but there would never be a time in which the French and Spanish monarch would be the same. The war overall benefited the English, but the French were still able to retain power. When Henry VII created the Protestant Church of England to divorce his first wife, he ended the power of the Pope in England. And so when he died, his powers passed to his son Edward and then to his Catholic daughter Mary, who got rid of the Church of England, and then back to a Protestant, his daughter Elizabeth. The power of the monarch in England was pretty much limited by Parliament, who ensured that the monarch didn't abuse their power. Queen Elizabeth and Parliament got along really, really well because she really allowed and even encouraged the members of Parliament to speak their mind, which was going to be a main thing that allowed her to get along with Parliament and get what she wanted from Parliament. Overall, the English began to question the power of the monarch more and more and more, wanting to go more toward a representative democracy. When Elizabeth died, the Tudor reign ended and the Stuart dynasty took over the monarchy in England. James I believed firmly in his ability to be a king and the divine right of his rule, and so he exercised absolute power over his subjects. His power, however, was threatened by the Puritans, who kind of felt like the Church of England was still too Catholic and needed to further purify itself. James is the first one to approve the first English version of the Bible that becomes known as the King James Bible. His younger son Charles became king and didn't get along well with Parliament because he refused to give him money, and so he dismissed Parliament and said, "We're not going to rule without Parliament," until about 1640. In 1640, he realized he was going to need more money, so he reconvened Parliament, trying to ensure that they would give him more money. But they were pretty angry at him at this point, so they took advantage of his weakness and required him to agree that Parliament had to be called every 3 years, or else they were not going to give him any money. But he was still looking for that moment in which he could dismiss Parliament for good. And so when a radical Puritan group within Parliament moved to abolish the appointment of bishops in the Anglican Church, he saw his opportunity to arrest them for treason because the church and the English government were still closely tied. He marched straight into Parliament to make the arrest and gave away his intention to take over Parliament. Now, since then, monarchs have only been allowed in Parliament once a year. The members of Parliament rose up against the king and the English Civil War began. The king relied on the royalists, or people that were loyal to the throne, for funding for his army. That was mainly going to be the nobles. The supporters of Parliament were known as the Roundheads due to the haircut that they had to match Parliament and were led by Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell kind of rose in power to become commander-in-chief of the army, and he required the king to surrender to him in 1646. When he took full control over England, he dismissed any members of Parliament that disagreed with him and kept the rest, and those became known as the Rump Parliament. Rump Parliament charged the king with treason and put him on trial before beheading him in front of his palace. This was the first time in which a monarch had ever been beheaded in that sense. After that, England became a commonwealth, or a type of republican government that was based on the common good of all people. While he was in power, Cromwell cracked down on different forms of entertainment and also began wars with Spain over trade. And a lot of people were troubled by the king's death. This was really the first time in which England didn't have some sort of king. And so Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher, argued that people needed a supreme ruler like a monarch in order to know how to live. Chaos would ensue. Following Cromwell's death, Parliament reinstated the monarchy in what became known as the Restoration. Parliament asked the son of beheaded Charles I to take over the crown, but with conditions. They didn't want the king to have too much power. So during the reign of Charles II, Parliament and the people tried to balance their power with the monarch as much as possible. One of the first things that they did was require the act of habeas corpus to be instated. We now have habeas corpus here in the United States. Habeas corpus required that someone accused of a crime should be tried in court in order to decide whether or not they were innocent. After Charles II, his brother James was next to rule, but was extremely unpopular because he was Catholic. At this point, most of England's going to be Protestant with the Church of England. Parliament and other groups of nobles invited James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband William to become King and Queen of England. So William and Mary became King and Queen in what became known as the Glorious Revolution because there was really no violence. Charles II James gave up his crown pretty easily, fled to France, and William and Mary took over. But before they became King and Queen, they signed the English Bill of Rights that would ensure that the English people had certain rights and continued to limit the rights of the monarchy. With this, England officially became a constitutional monarchy, meaning that they were a monarchy, but the King and Queen were very limited by law, meaning that Parliament would have more power. Now, in Russia, they were far behind the rest of Europe in technological advances. The printing press hadn't really made its way over there, and there was other major technological advances in manufacturing that hadn't quite gotten there. Russia was mainly run by church officials and boyars, but in 1546, Ivan claimed the title of Tsar, or ruler, and intended to rule without any limits on his power. During his reign, Ivan made many reforms, such as a general council. He had military appointments based on merit rather than favoritism, and also a new legal code that reduced the boyars' power. But he quickly became known as Ivan the Terrible because his oppressive policies as killing his advisors, and he also instituted a secret police that would go and spy on people and brutally punish anyone who opposed him. He even killed his own son to ensure that he would keep the throne. Following Ivan, the Romanov family took over power in Russia, and Peter the Great was crowned as Tsar. Peter sought to modernize Russia through a process became known as Westernization. Before he became king, he had kind of went around to the rest of Europe and figured out some of the things that Russia needed to do in order to make their government better. So he modernized the military, he brought the church under state control, he built up industry, he started a newspaper, and sponsored a whole bunch of new schools to ensure learning. He even ordered Russia to adopt more westernized dress and social customs. Lastly, he founded a new city called St. Petersburg, after himself, that became known for its westernized architecture. In the picture down in the bottom, you can see a picture of St. Petersburg today, but that basilica in the middle kind of represented some of the beautiful architecture in the rest of Europe. Russia's next Tsarina became known as Catherine the Great, and she continued the westernized reforms of Peter the Great, and she removed restrictions on trade and helped to improve schools. However, she experienced quite a little bit of conflict from Poland, who wanted to be free of Russian rule, and she reorganized the local governments that gave her and the king more power. Now, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire is now what is modern-day Germany. They were headed by a single emperor led by the Habsburg family, but that person didn't have absolute power. Germany and the Holy Roman Empire overall was broken into smaller states that each had their own ruler. When the emperor ruled that two Protestant churches be shut down, peasants revolted, which started the 30 Years' War, in which the peasants and the people questioned the power of the Holy Roman family. The smaller states didn't really appreciate the king's control, and so the Protestants and the Catholics started warring over each other, fighting to figure out who was going to have more power. The Spanish joined in on the side of the Catholics and the Holy Roman Empire, while the French joined on behalf of the Protestants because the Huguenots were very powerful there. The 30 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the war by reducing the power of the Holy Roman Emperor and extending religious tolerance to all Germans. Austria and Prussia are last. When the Holy Roman Emperor died without a male heir, his daughter Maria Theresa took the throne, but their rivals, the Hohenzollerns, led by Frederick the Great, wanted power over that area. Maria Theresa and the Hohenzollerns entered the War of Austrian Succession, trying to decide who would be the next monarch. She was able to retain control, but Frederick the Great gained Silesia, a province in the western part, for Prussia, increasing the size of the Prussian Empire. This resulted in another war becoming known as the 7 Years' War and expanded into America with their allies, the British, and then they fought along Austria, France, and Russia for control. The war extended into the colonies, and Prussia emerged as the strongest military power in Europe overall. Make sure that you read back over your notes and you have all the necessary vocabulary. Thanks for joining me for this video, and I'll see you in class.